This video contains spoilers for all of these games. Watch at your own discretion. First released in 2016, Yakuza Kiwami is a full remake of the series' first entry on the PS2 back in 2005. Kiwami keeps the original game's story intact, with all scenes being near one-to-one recreations of the PS2 originals, with the only additions to the story being new scenes involving Nishiki, which delve more into what happened to him while Kiryu was in prison. I feel the need to mention this as many remakes often add in scenes that can interrupt the original story or make changes to scenes that can just sometimes feel unnecessary. So I think it's nice RGG went out of their way to, at least on a story level, preserve that aspect while adding in something that in my opinion helps flesh out the game's main antagonist, which is something the original Yakuza arguably needed after Zero. In terms of gameplay, Kiwami follows closely in Yakuza Zero's footsteps, with Kiryu possessing the same three fighting styles from Zero, which have each received some slight adjustments, most notably to Rush, which received numerous buffs to increase its utility. In addition, Kiryu has received a new fighting style based on his classic moveset. Prior to Zero, Kiryu and every other character only had a single moveset, so this new dragon style aims to give the player access to his old gameplay. For new content, Kiwami introduces two retooled minigames present in Zero, the return of Pocket Circuit as well as this new, bug-themed wrestling game with scantily clad women, which is just a reskin of another minigame present in Zero. The biggest new addition to the game, and easily the most divisive mechanic probably ever introduced in the Yakuza series, comes in the form of Majima Everywhere. Before diving into this, I think it's important to give some context if you're not as familiar with the series. So Yakuza 0, the game released before Kiwami, featured dual protagonists, with half of the game focusing on Kiryu and the other half focusing on Goro Majima. In prior games, Majima was always an important side character and a reoccurring boss, but was never playable in a mainline game. Even the entries which featured 4 and 5 different protagonists, Majima was not among them. However, even before Zero came out, Majima was consistently the most popular character in the series behind Kiryu. So for this prequel, Majima was given a large focus and finally the role as a proper protagonist. This is all important because Yakuza 0 was massive. It was not only single-handedly responsible for pushing the series to new heights in the West, but also was a massive hit with the series' core Japanese fan base. And one of the big reasons for the latter was the focus on Majima. So when remaking the original game, the devs decided to put a larger focus on Majima. The problem with this is that Majima himself is overall not very prevalent in Yakuza 1 as a whole, and when he is given screen time, he's pretty much always depicted as a crazy person. He kidnaps a child, beats one of his own men to near death with an umbrella and a baseball bat, and crashes a truck into a brothel, all just to get to Kiryu. He even takes a near-lethal blow for the guy just so he can be the one to kill him. In general, the original Yakuza just kinda presents Majima as a complete psycho who only really cares about killing Kiryu. However, starting in Yakuza 2, his role would massively shift, with him becoming one of Kiryu's closest allies. While he would still appear as a reoccurring boss and be absolutely insane, his role as an antagonist would completely vanish. So how does Kiwami remedy this issue while keeping Majima's role in the story the same? Well, it's interesting to say the least. Early on in the game, after Kiryu gets released from his 10 years in the joint, Majima immediately sees him and starts a fight with him. You can win this fight technically, but you're expected to lose. After this encounter, Majima realizes how soft Kiryu has gotten in the 10 years since they've been apart, so Majima takes it upon himself to personally whip Kiryu back into shape, leading to Kiwami's major defining gimmick, the Majima Everywhere system. Basically, Majima appears on random spots on the map, and if you run into him, you initiate a fight. Sometimes you can see him wandering around, and other times he'll ambush you from different hiding spots or just join in on random encounters. After hitting certain thresholds, you'll get a special event with Majima, which just ends with you fighting him again, and after beating him, you unlock abilities for your dragon style. This is the primary method for unlocking abilities for this style, so if you want to use it, you have to engage with this mechanic. It's worth noting that the dragon style is easily the best in the game when fully upgraded, with Kiwami being arguably one of the strongest iterations of Kiryu ever to exist. While I think Majima Everywhere is an interesting idea on paper, the final product leaves a lot to be desired. The biggest issue to me is that even after fully unlocking everything in the dragon style, and seeing every possible event involving Majima, Majima never goes away. He is a constant presence in Kiwami, and fighting him gets very old very fast. past. Like Kiryu, Majima has 4 different styles all based on Zero, and once you've fought one each, there's not really much more to the fights than that. But you still have to fight Majima a lot, and sometimes without your consent. Even though you can see and predict where Majima is on the map, as mentioned before, there are still places where Majima can ambush the player, forcing an encounter. Keep in mind too, these aren't like short mini-bosses. Majima comes packed with tons of health, more than a lot of the major boss fights in the game. By the end of the game, each Majima encounter comes rocking like 7 or 8 health bars, which is only made all the more frustrating due to another mechanic exclusive to this remake. Pretty much every boss in Kiwami is capable of regenerating health. Even scrub fodder fights are able to do this. Now this actually isn't something unheard of for the series, as several bosses in the past have also been capable of this. However, it wasn't nearly as annoying as Kiwami makes it. They recover health at a staggering rate, and if uninterrupted, they will likely recover more than a full health bar. These aren't unstoppable, as you can use a specific heat action based on the color to stop them, but they're still a massive pace breaker to every fight and add nothing of value to Kiwami's bosses, and it especially doesn't add anything after the 50th Majima encounter. To top all of this off, Majima's original presence in the story is pretty much left intact, with him still being portrayed as an antagonist for the most part, although they do notably try to lighten his edge in some of his dialogue, and a small extension of his introduction scene which teases the everywhere system. A small new mandatory fight was also added to help fix a continuity error created by the Majima everywhere system. You see, in the original, after Majima takes the stab wound for Kiryu, you don't see him again until their late game final encounter, in which he shows surprise over Majima's survival. This obviously doesn't work in Kiwami, as immediately after taking that stab wound, Majima goes back to stalking Kiryu. So a new fight was added where you team up with Majima to beat up some goons, and eventually Majima gets shot and then Kiryu just leaves for some reason. Outside of those additions, his role in Yakuza 1's story plays out the same, which makes his actions in the main story alone quite tonally jarring when compared to their other interactions added in this game. And I wish my grievances with Kiwami ended there, but unfortunately there's still more to talk about. RGG Studios is well known for their extremely quick turnout of games, accomplished by the abundant reuse of assets. This approach has allowed the Yakuza series to maintain a consistent release schedule, with a high-quality title being released pretty much every year. While this is an extremely effective and efficient way to develop games, it does come with cons, and as someone who's played almost every single game in the series, you start to notice the reused assets. Kiwami makes this especially apparent, as many bosses who had original movesets were Frankenstein together using other boss fights. The most apparent case of this is with one of the game's earliest boss fights against Shimao. Shimao is an early boss fight and has a relatively simple moveset that's pretty quick to overwhelm. For Kiwami, rather than expand his old moveset, they instead just opted to make him Mr Shakedown from Yakuza 0. For those unaware, Mr Shakedown was a mini-boss who functioned pretty similar to how Majima works in Kiwami. He's a massive, super strong enemy who doesn't stagger from any attacks and causes knockdown with all of his attacks that make it quite difficult to safely attack him. Most of these traits also apply to the Shimano fight in Kiwami, which just makes for an extremely unfun boss fight where you have to slowly whittle his health down and you can't even get any big combos on him because he doesn't stagger, all while your upgrades and abilities are extremely low, making this just an all-around really unpleasant fight to deal with. Shimano isn't the only fight that changed for the worst. One of the last bosses in the game, Jingu, is another notorious fight in Kiwami. Basically, Jingu isn't a fighter, so he instead relies on 2 bodyguards to protect him while taking pot shots at you with his silly little gun. In the original, this fight is relatively simple. While Jingu takes pot shots at you, they don't do too much damage nor interrupt you, so you can mainly focus on the bodyguards and then deal with him. Up close on his own, he has practically no way of defending himself, and once defeated, the fight ends. Kiwami greatly changed this fight, although part of it has to do with changes introduced in 0. Starting in Yakuza 0, if shot, Kiryu will immediately crumple to the ground, which unfortunately also applies to Jingu. This one simple change makes another simple fight in the original an absolute nightmare, with Jingu constantly firing shots that knock Kiryu down. He also throws bombs at Kiryu now, which, sure, why not? On the highest difficulty, this fight is genuinely one of the hardest in the series, and not really for any particularly good reason. It's more annoying than it is an actual genuine challenge. By the way, in Kiwami specifically, you're forced to have defeated both the bodyguards, whereas the original, the fight ends once Jingu is defeated. In addition, the bodyguards will revive immediately after beating them and even get a heat aura, which gives them an attack boost. Also, because Jingu is a Kiwami boss, he too can regenerate health. Jingu is easily one of RGG's worst designed boss fights, which isn't really a secret at all. There are other pretty notable examples of Kiwami reusing boss fight movesets, but these are the ones that stood out to me. The last major issue I have with Kiwami has to do with visuals, which might sound confusing at first, but hear me out. While on a technical level, Kiwami looks better, it loses a lot of the original's more subtle details. A prime example would be Kiryu's facial expressions, which underwent a severe loss in quality when compared to the original, with Kiwami Kiryu's face often just looking kinda pissed all the time. Other characters also suffer this effect as well. There are also scenes that lost details, like this one with Kiryu and Utabori, the tattoo artist. In the original, Utabori's parlor is filled with different tattoos plastered all over the walls, and Kiwami didn't bother retaining this detail at all, leaving most of the wall entirely blank. Stuff like this is really minor in the grand scheme of things, I understand, but when you remake a game and actively go out of your way to recreate every scene, I think it's pretty notable when you lose subtle details like this. Kiwami is a remake that was definitely made on the cheap and seems to lack a lot of clear foresight, the best example of this being a scene at the end of the game. During the explosion at the Millennium Tower, the game briefly focuses on an unnamed homeless man who begins collecting the money from the fallout. Except, this homeless man isn't unnamed, as in Yakuza 4, this character is later explained to be Shun Akiyama, and he would later become a major player in the next few Yakuza games going forward. So for a remake, it would obviously make sense to incorporate Akiyama here to keep with consistency. Unfortunately, Kiwami doesn't do this, and instead it's just a random homeless dude again. I have no clue why they didn't do this other than just simply forgetting about it, which is more embarrassing than anything else. It's not like just having Akiyama in this scene would be distracting at all, it would just fit with the continuity. I'm really not sure why they didn't. It's such an odd choice that I'll never understand, but maybe it was intentional for whatever reason. The cutscenes were also entirely re-recorded for Kiwami. What you prefer ultimately comes down to preference, though I do think there are some scenes in the original that hit a bit harder than they do in Kiwami.
俺につけさせろや。やめろ。やめるんだ。錦。錦。俺につけさせろや。やめろ。やめるんだ。錦。錦。
Okay, so this is where my original script for this part ended, but there are a few loose ends I feel the need to make mention of. First, I want to compliment Kiwami's combat, as on its own it is pretty fun, and the small improvements over Zero are very appreciated. I would say, minus the obvious healing gimmick, Kiwami does play better than the original. But to be fair to that game, it was quite literally the first one, so it's hard to give it too much flack for combat. And all things considered, it hasn't aged terribly at all. I think the idea of Yakuza 1 being outdated is a bigger issue than the game itself actually being outdated. Even so, Kiwami still wins here. The second thing I didn't mention is music. I'll be talking a little more about music in later parts of this video, but Kiwami's soundtrack is quite different. And Kiwami adds in a substantial amount of new tracks for bosses that didn't have unique songs prior, which is nice. I'll let you decide for yourself what's better. third has to do with an odd change made to one of the game's sub-stories. Sub-story 7, or Mission 7, revolves around the identity of a character who was killed early on in the story. The original game had full animated cutscenes for this event, which for some reason Kiwami downgraded to just being a basic sub-story. This change is especially odd since, to my knowledge, most other sub-story cutscenes were remade, but not this one. The last thing to note is Yakuza 1's original dub. When bringing the original over to the West, Sega opted to dub over the game, and hired a lot of big-name talent including Mark Hamill as Majima, who legitimately does not even remember this role. This dub is pretty infamous for its extremely low quality, adding a bunch of unnecessary swears and even a slur said by Kiryu himself.
Unlike you, at least Kazuki-san has made a name for himself without any help. You fucking Yakuza! Don't fuck with Kazuki-san!
How many times I gotta tell you, I'm not Yakuza. You retarded or just deaf?
Personally, I find stuff like this funny, but if you don't, then this is another thing that could easily prevent someone from enjoying the original. Luckily, there is a mod that exists that restores the original Japanese dub, which is how I'd recommend playing this if you're interested. Overall, Kiwami is an extremely subpar remake that's mainly carried by the core of Yakuza 1 being so good. The game feels pretty low quality compared to other entries, and that's likely because it wasn't a huge priority for RGG, as not only was Yakuza 6 on their horizon, but it featured an entirely new engine that would go on to define the series as a whole, so he likely was more or less a low-budget title to fill in the gap while 6 was being developed. Kiwami isn't an awful game by any means, but it's a subpar remake in my opinion. There's still plenty of fun that can be had with it, but even on its own, I don't think it stands up nearly as well as other mainline games, and unfortunately, the follow-up to this isn't much better. Yakuza Kiwami 2 is a remake of Yakuza 2 released only 2 years after the original Kiwami. Unlike the previous title, Kiwami 2 runs on the new Dragon engine, which vastly improves upon many aspects of the series from combat to exploration, now all being seamless. So how does this remake compare to the previous one? Does it improve upon any of the things that bothered me in Kiwami? Not really. In fact, I'd argue it does many things worse, but let's start slow. In terms of gameplay, Kiwami 2 plays similar to the previous title released a year prior, Yakuza 6. Kiwami 2 attempts to remedy a lot of common complaints many fans had with 6's combat system. 6 marked the introduction of the Dragon engine, and with it came a lot of growing pains. Kiryu is a lot less versatile, with him notably lacking many of his classic techniques and heat actions. To compensate, Kiryu was given a new install known as Extreme Heat Mode, which allowed him to quickly overpower pretty much every enemy in the game with ease. Still, Kiryu was notably lacking, with even a fully upgraded Kazuma not quite reaching the same levels of absurd strength as previous entries. Kiwami 2 buffed Kiryu considerably, with him regaining many old heat actions and techniques alongside a repertoire of new tools, including a new basic charge attack you can use to open up enemies, which allows for much easier combos. Weapons also make a return. Previous titles allowed characters to craft and equip different tools of mass destruction, although the crafting aspect of it, which forced you to run around town to scrounge up materials for it, combined with the limited durability, often made it not as useful as I think they intended it to be. 6 completely removed this, with weapons now only dropping from defeated enemies and you aren't able to keep or equip any. Kiwami 2 made it a point to bring this back. All in all, Kiwami 2 is a pretty substantial upgrade to 6 in theory. Combos are easier to perform, and Kiryu is given a lot more tools to play around with. Unfortunately, not everything offered is inherently better. This is a personal thing, but I've just never found either of the early Dragon engines offerings spectacular when it comes to combat. Because of the new engine, RGG completely reworked the combat, and its initial outings had some rough spots that future entries would later address. One of my biggest complaints with these early engine games is this weird mechanic where if an attack is blocked, you'll bounce off the enemy, which always just made basic street fights annoying without extreme heat. There are other small issues I have, but none of them are like objective faults. In general, especially the original PS4 version, combat was noticeably slower and less snappy than every game prior. And you know, that isn't inherently a bad thing, but I just don't like how these games feel in comparison to the more arcadey feeling older games. I'm bringing up Yakuza 6 a lot rather than 2 because their gameplay is much more comparable. Best way I could explain it is that Kiwami 2's combat isn't really a proper remake of 2's, as Kiryu's fighting style has changed pretty drastically since the Dragon engine, so instead it's more of an extension of Yakuza 6's gameplay. a revision if you will. In a way, you could already consider the Dragon Engine's moveset as an evolution, but personally I just view them as different. Overall, despite the improvements made to 6's combat, the game really doesn't feel much better to me at all. Although I think part of that also comes from the fact that Kiwami 2's boss fights aren't nearly as good as 6. I mentioned before that RGG is well known for reusing assets, and one of the clearest examples of this comes from the consistent recycling of movesets. Again, this isn't inherently a bad thing, but it's important to note that both Kiwami games replace movesets from the PS2 versions that were original. Ryuji Goda, the game's main antagonist, suffers from this greatly, and in turn, so does the game's final boss. His moveset in the original was simple. He had strong, fairly fast punches, kicks, and grabs, and was generally very difficult to get full combos on, as he'd quickly counter you if you attempted to attack him from the front. It's a relatively basic moveset, but I think it thrives because of that, as it actively forced me to change how I approached him and led to a very engaging final fight. Kiwami 2 changed Ryuji's moveset pretty drastically, with him being significantly slower, going for these longer strings and this running grab he spams constantly that's a complete joke to dodge. I do think they tried to replicate aspects of the original fight, as he does try to do similar counters if you attack him head on, but these are way easier to dodge than in the original, and because of how Kiwami 2 works, it's hard to even land proper back combos on him. He just doesn't feel like a match for Kiryu in this game. This fight is just a massive downgrade in my opinion, with the only interesting addition being a new dramatic intro, but it doesn't really salvage it for me. Ryuji, unfortunately, isn't the only boss that got butchered in the transition. Another fan favorite encounter, the two tigers, work very differently in Kiwami 2. In the original, while the tigers don't flinch at a basic combo, you can still perform them, and if you land a finisher, they occasionally get knocked back. In Kiwami 2, all attacks bounce off the tigers the exact same way they do if an enemy guards, meaning you can't do any combos on these guys. It's a confusing change that just makes the fight so much worse. Why remove the ability to perform basic attacks on a boss like this? However, when it comes to bosses with unnecessary changes, there's no fight more deserving of ridicule than the one against the Man in Black. This is a character who frequently fights against Kiryu during various long battles, and in the original he isn't too notable. Clearly someone on the staff was a fan though, as not only did he return sporting a new design, something which a lot of characters got in Kiwami 2, which we'll get to later, but they also gave him these new, awful, stupid, fucking dumb boots with blades on them. So now, every attack he does both can't be blocked and immediately knocks you down upon contact, leading to one of the most frustrating boss fights in the series, mainly due to his heat aura, which makes hitting him with basic combos a near impossible task. Heat auras were a thing in previous games that also made it harder to combo bosses, but in those, you could easily target an opponent's back for easier combos. Kiwami 2 doesn't really allow for this, so most of the time you can only really rely on extreme heat mode to do big damage against him, which the Man in Black can easily disrupt with his blades, as they take massive chunks of your heat gauge if they hit. Fights like this really make me wonder how the devs actually intended for you to approach it, and the likely answer is weapons. As mentioned before, Kiwami 2 made a pretty big deal about the return of weapons, as they're often scattered everywhere during major long battles to an often comical degree. Even with them, I still think this fight is awful, and I'll never understand this change. Another odd change made to gameplay has to do with Feel the Heat. Basically, during major encounters, after hitting a certain health threshold, the enemy will be stunned, allowing Kiryu to charge up his heat to perform a finisher. In the original, your heat remains wherever it was when this mode started, and if it's full, you can go right into the special. For some reason in Kiwami 2, they just dump all your heat beforehand, so the minute this starts, you're forced to mash in order to build it up. Although I do have to say, Kiwami 2 does improve this by having you mash the attack button instead of the right bumper like the PS2 version, which is a horrible button to mash for any human, so I can see why they decided to change this. Something else of note is the fact that both this and 6 made the strange choice to replace all boss heat auras with a generic red one, rather than unique ones for each boss. On that note, let's talk about Kiwami 2's visuals. Graphically, Kiwami 2 is definitely a notable improvement over Kiwami, in part due to the overall upgrades visually from the new Dragon Engine. However, Kiwami 2 looking good is really only in theory, as there's one big mean green problem we have to address. So for some unknown reason to any of us, Kiwami 2 employs a pretty noticeable green filter for a large chunk of the game. The original Kiwami also had a filter similar to this, so it's possible they did this in an attempt to give the games a more retro look using a more nostalgic color grading. Regardless, regardless of intent, I have to be honest, I think they did a bad job because, at least to me, this nasty green fog doesn't invoke nostalgia at all. More so activates my fight or flight response. One thing I want to note too is that while the original Kiwami also has a filter, it's nowhere near as harsh as Kiwami 2's, which completely douses every scene in green. This bizarre attempt to give the Kiwami games a more nostalgic feel created a game that looks significantly worse than the one released just 2 years before it. Yakuza 6, especially for the time, looked gorgeous and still holds up really well today, and it accomplished it without the need of an awful filter. I think what makes the green worse for me is the fact that it's not even consistent. Both Sotenburi's night and daytime aesthetics don't have it at all, and neither does Komurocho during the day. But when night comes, I guess the fog rolls in. It's also hard-coded into some building interiors, but again, not every interior is like this. And you know, when the filter isn't present, the game looks really nice, but when it is present, it just washes out so many of the natural colors and lighting, all just to make it green. There's no way of turning this off at all, so the only way to be rid of it is with a mod, which only does so much, as it's still baked into many of the in-game cutscenes. Speaking of cutscenes, like Kiwami, there were many scenes that weren't redone the best. There's a few notable examples, such as pretty much every scene involving Ryo Takashima, who looks completely different in Kiwami 2. This is because his actor changed, and so they decided to model his face after him, and the design kinda suffers for it in my opinion. But I think there's no better scene to talk about for the transition than the beginning of chapter 12. A somber moment where Kiryu reflects on his actions from 26 years ago, which inadvertently caused the death of Sayama's family. The original game played an extremely melancholy jazz song, while Kiwami 2 replaced it with a pop-punk song. Now, I'd love nothing more than to play the scenes here to do a direct comparison, but unfortunately, I can't do that because both of these songs are copyrighted, which makes talking about them pretty hard. For me, the song in Kiwami 2 is much more ill-fitting, but again, music is very subjective. What's less subjective is the fact that Kiwami 2's direction of the scene is much worse. In the scene, Kiryu ends up getting stabbed by a homeless man, and when he gets stabbed, all sound cuts out before the rain resumes, revealing what happened to him. The music in the original is timed so that the instruments start up again when he removes the knife. Kiwami 2 omits both of these details, as not only does the song not time to him removing the knife, but instead of cutting the audio, they just play this stock stabbing sound effect when it happens. It also plays this unsheathing sound when he removes it, which is even goofier. I'll link a proper comparison in the description so you can judge them for yourself. But in my opinion, this scene was completely butchered, and for seemingly no reason, it's like they completely forgot the intent and direction of the original. There are other scenes I could microanalyze, but we'd be here for too long if I did that, so I'll just say that there's a lot of other scenes I have similar complaints for, including a small scene that was cut where Kiryu and Sayama play slots, which makes perfect sense as to why it was removed. After all, gambling is just way too hardcore for a game like this. A scene in Chapter 4 didn't bother recreating the sunset, so instead of this nice cool orange, you get more goddamn green. Isn't that wonderful? This is actually just an all-around issue with Kiwami 2, as there's no midday setting at all, despite it being present in the original. Outside of cutscenes, there's a couple of other small downgrades worth noting. The outside of the Omi Alliance headquarters lost all of its reflective surface, making it look a lot duller. Serena, an area which is supposed to be run down, looks significantly more intact in Kiwami 2. Even with these, I do understand that most people don't care about stuff like this, so I'll leave it up to you to decide what looks better. So outside of the green, another thing Kiwami 2 has become infamous for is the removal of content. There are two main culprits for this. The first comes from an entire city district that was cut for Kiwami 2, Shinseicho, based on the real-life city of Shinsekai. Although it was small, it was still an important area in the game, mainly in Chapter 11, and housed a couple different sub-stories as well as the Yatsuba acupuncture clinic, which was required for Kiryu to relearn many old techniques. Kiwami 2 opted to not include this area at all, allocating all of its story and some of its shops to Sotenburi itself. This includes the acupuncture clinic. On the surface, I do sorta understand why. Shinseicho is only really prominently featured in one chapter of the game, and there's very little to do there otherwise. Remaking an entire city district for only a small part of the game, and for something that they could likely never really use again, is time and resource consuming, so I do understand why. While Shinseicho is only a small part of the original Yakuza 2, a remake would be the perfect place to expand on this. Give you more room to explore, add in some new shops or mini games here, but no. Instead, they just didn't even bother trying to add actually expand on something that could have used more and just completely removed it. I understand that it would have taken time to redo, but why bother remaking a game if you're just going to remove an entire area like this? It's not like it was a part of the game that was objectively bad or that people disliked. It just seems like they removed it to save on time and resources. The second major loss came from the host club Adam. This is a minigame in Komorocho where Kiryu takes on the role of being a host, trying to please different female patrons, essentially making it a role reversal of the series classic hostess minigame. Kiwami 2 just completely removed this altogether. And listen, I'm not going to tell you that this is one of the greatest minigames in the series, but it's another area where a remake could easily expand and improve upon what's already there. And it frustrates me that instead of doing anything with the ideas, they just opted to cut them. Luckily, Kiwami 2 does offer some new minigames. Well, maybe the word new is a bit of a stretch, but there are some additions to the game. Biggest is a new mode known as Majima Construction. This is a tower defense game where you place different units around to defend Majima's construction site from would-be attackers. Now maybe it's just me, but I don't find this minigame fun at all. This may partially stem from the fact that I'm already not a huge RTS fan, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that even if I was a fan, I would probably still dislike this mode. The controls are cumbersome, the gameplay is extremely basic and monotonous, there's a fucking gacha pull system where you can only pull one unit at a time and can't skip the summoning animation. I hate this mode. It doesn't add anything to Kiwami 2 other than just being another thing to complete, and I don't find it fun at all. RGG is capable of making a lot of fun mini-games with different genres, but I guess RTSs just isn't one of their strong suits. But the biggest issue I have with this minigame is that it's not even original. It's derivative of a mode appearing in Yakuza 6, only in that one you played on the offense. As we've discussed many times by now, RGG reuses a lot of assets, and this is another major con of that. Rather than making something wholly original for Kiwami 2, they basically opted to just reuse a minigame from their last entry. This is an issue also present in Kiwami, as two of its new side activities were also lifted wholesale from Zero. Speaking of reusing major pieces of content from Zero, Kiwami's other, new, minigame is exactly that. The cabaret management returns from Zero, and unlike the clan creator, receives zero changes to how it plays or even how it looks. It is near one-to-one the exact same, with the only major change being that you're Kiryu and not Majima. The location of the club is also different, but the interior is literally the exact same, which I just find extremely funny and lazy more than anything else. It is really hard for me to defend this inclusion because it's so pointless. The only reason I can see for it even existing is to grind yen, but it just rubs me the wrong way, especially when there's content they just straight up removed, and in its place is this. A hollow copy of a beloved mode from Zero. It just feels like cheap fan service made to appeal to people who started with Zero, which shouldn't be necessary to sell this game to people, and I don't think there's anything more pertinent to the idea of cheap fan service than the new expansion included with Kiwami 2, the Majima Saga. The Majima Saga is a new side story available partway through the main game. As the name would imply, this saga stars Majima and takes place a few years before Yakuza 2, exploring why Majima left the Tojo clan and started his own construction company. A normal playthrough would probably take less than 2 hours, with most of that being spent on cutscenes. I skipped most of the ones in my playthrough and it lasted me only about 45 minutes. The actual gameplay parts of the Majima Saga are extremely shallow, with you mostly being forced to fight different enemies that just stand statically on the map that you can't avoid. Majima uses his Mad Dog style from Zero as his moveset, and it is genuinely awful to play as. His combos are slow, and his finishers are so unwieldy they pretty much never land. Even a basic string is often difficult just because of how much he moves during it. All of these statements are also applicable to the Mad Dog style in Zero, but that version still has significantly more in his toolkit, like an incredible counter that melts health bars. Kiwami 2 Majima has pretty much nothing by comparison. He has his basic combo strings that are complete dog shit, 2 heat actions, and a spin that he can do instead of a grab. The last one, by the way, is easily the best. It does a comical amount of damage, actually hits enemies unlike his other moves, and pretty much has no consequence to spamming it. So late into the mode, I just spammed this to win. Late into the game itself is kinda relative here, as there's almost nothing to actually do in the Majima Saga. Majima gains no experience, has no skills he can unlock, or anything to really do outside of the main story. You can do pretty much every mini minigame as Majima, which is neat, but outside of the character model being different, they all play exactly the same. You know, it actually would have made more sense for the new minigames Majima Construction and the Cabaret Club to be here instead of for Kiryu, as both have a way stronger connection to him than Kazuma, but justifying that would require this mode to be longer and for the story to be reworked. As stated before, this saga attempts to fill in the gap as to why Majima left the Tojo clan between Yakuza 1 and 2, something which to me doesn't really need a full story about since it's not very interesting or important at all. Instead, the most notable thing about the story is the fact that it features the return of Makoto Makimura, a character who played a pivotal role in Majima's development in Zero. And I kinda hate this. A lot, actually. Majima and Makoto's story ended with Zero. The entire point of the final scene with them, and their relationship as a whole, is that their worlds don't mix. They can never mix. The final shot of him walking away, blending into the crowd, should have been the last time they ever saw each other. There's no real narrative reason to use her again, outside of just being another cheap way to please fans. They even meet again in the exact same location as Zero. It just feels like such a haphazard way to write in a way for them to meet again, and it only really serves to dampen the more tragic ending of Majima's story in Zero, wrapping it up in a nice happy bow that really shouldn't exist in my opinion. I mentioned before how Majima's larger role in these remakes can in part be attributed to his character in Zero, and it changed how they decided to portray him in these remakes, giving him a much greater sense of importance that didn't exist initially. Not to imply that he wasn't important in other games, but he was never the heart of the stories he was in, playing the role more or less of a comic relief rival for Kiryu, with later entries fleshing out the character more, eventually culminating in his starring role in Zero. All of this is good, but the massive success of Zero has the unfortunate consequence of creating a new standard for the character that didn't exist beforehand, and rather than having full confidence in what was originally there, they felt the need to push Majima into games where he wasn't needed as a cheap way to appeal to these new players. To me, the Majima saga represents some of RGG's worst as both game developers and writers, and it's really sad that this expansion feels like that to me, because I wouldn't have minded another true outing as Majima, but this half-assed mode attached to a remake I already don't enjoy very much doesn't do anything for me. If anything, a side saga in a Yakuza 2 remake should have focused on Sayama more than anyone else. A side story involving her makes way more sense than Majima, but Majima is way more popular, so of course he was the pick. Like, her nickname is literally the Yakuza Huntress. You're telling me you can't make a compelling side saga out of that? The only thing I like and ever hear other people talk about from this saga is the dynamic intro with the final boss, which is pretty cool. The song is good too, but both are kinda wasted on this character. The fight itself is also kinda ass. It's near identical to another moveset RGG has been reusing for like 20 years at this point. The only other thing left to mention is this weird feature where you can transfer items over to Kiryu, which... Is there any reason to even do this? Like, why is this a feature? I'm not even trying to be pedantic. Is there actually any point to doing this? I hate the Majima saga, and it's one of, if not the worst things RGG has ever made in my opinion, but I'm sure this mode has its fans. The only other thing left to talk about for Kiwami 2 is the music. Music is where this is probably going to get the most subjective, but this is another area where I prefer the original. It had a heavier focus on grungy sounding metal with hip-hop samples, which I prefer, and I often find fits better than many of their replacements in Kiwami 2, as they redid pretty much all of the music. That's not to say any of it is bad, as Kiwami 2 does have some pretty solid tracks, including the new battle theme against Koji Shinda, which is fantastic and definitely stronger than the original. But as for the rest of the music, I vastly prefer the original, but I'll let you decide what you think sounds better. While Kiwami 2 is far from the worst remake we'll be covering in this series, it's one that always particularly annoyed me. I can't objectively say this is a terrible game, but I can definitely argue it's an extremely subpar remake. But I'm more than likely in the minority on that, as I know there are plenty of people who stand by this game. For me, even though the original is much simpler, it's still an extremely solid game that holds up very well, arguably better than many Yakuza games that came after it. If you enjoy Kiwami 2, that's fine, but I'd still wholeheartedly recommend trying the PS2 original. Compared to many early franchises, it's aged pretty gracefully overall, though maybe you feel differently. Still, I think there's tons of value in this game, and it's sad for me to see it so often overlooked compared to its remake. The same goes for Yakuza 1. Even though these games are old, they're far from being so outdated that you can't play and enjoy them. Unfortunately, RGG doesn't offer the classic Yakuza games for modern consoles. There was a collection of both 1 and 2 released for the PS3 and the fucking Wii U of all consoles, but they were only released in Japan, and as of making this are still stuck on there. I really do hope RGG will go out of their way to port these games so that more people will try them out. You might think this video is over, but we're not quite done yet, as there's still one last Kiwami game to look at. First released in 2014 exclusively in Japan, Ryu Go Gotoki Ishin is a spin-off of the Like a Dragon series set in the Edo period of Japan. The game didn't receive any release in the West due to them not having confidence in such a game rooted in Japanese history catching on. The series itself was already barely hanging on in the West, with fans having to petition to get Yakuza 5 released in America, so that also likely played a part. This changed in 2022, with the series now being firmly established in the West. RGG had significantly more confidence in a title like this after the success of Ghost of Tsushima, and so a full remake of the game was created and released in February 2023, finally offering overseas fans the chance to experience the game properly. I should also note that while the game is called Like a Dragon Ishin in most regions, in Japan the game kept the Kiwami branding being known as Ishin Kiwami, so I'll be continuing to refer to it as such. As a fan, this was pretty vilifying, and at the time I was loving finally getting the chance to play this game, but I knew, even without playing the original, that there were definitely questionable areas of this remake. Still, I was always interested in trying the original, and this series gave me the perfect excuse to try it out. So how do both games measure up to each other? Well, let's start with the new content, which there, kinda isn't any, actually. There are some small additions like new karaoke songs as well as special remixes for a few boss fights, but the core of Ishin is near identical to the original release with no major new pieces of content to speak of. The biggest change this remake has gameplay-wise involves the trooper cards. These were also present in the original, but they were exclusive to trooper missions. They're basically just these repetitive little dungeons where you fight a bunch of enemies and a boss at the end. Boring and not very entertaining, but good for grinding. The unique thing in this mode are these cards you can get via another gacha pull system which give little buffs. Ishin Kiwami places a much larger focus on these cards, giving different extremely powerful effects and attacks. You can also now use these outside of trooper missions, which I might have suggested is significantly game-breaking, which they kind of are. There's cards that can slow down time, create black holes, create massive AoE explosions, and do literal fucking kamehamehas. And I think they added this stuff for two reasons. One, to closer align it to the previous game released, Like a Dragon, which also featured many bizarre and surreal super attacks. The second is more so related to how they changed combat itself. Unlike the previous Kiwami games, Ishin actually retains most of the original's basic gameplay, but you notably do a lot less damage in this version and have a much harder time doing combos, causing fights to go on significantly longer. So these trooper cards might be to help minimize this issue, but either way, I don't find these mesh well with the game anyways. They're tonally jarring and just don't fit the vibe of Ishin. Not that Ishin itself was grounded in reality, but it's just kinda silly that Ryoma is the only one capable of this wacky woo-ha magic bullshit. It doesn't help that they decided to make these special DLC trooper cards featuring Kenny Omega, which is based, and Nanners, which is not based. It also has a bunch of other people I don't know and don't care enough to look into. Luckily, the game doesn't actually force you to use these or any cards past the tutorial, so if they bother you, you can simply choose not to use them. Although you'll have to contest with the fact that most fights will likely take a lot longer than they should. Outside of that, the basic gameplay remains pretty identical to the original. One small aspect that Ishin Kiwami improves upon is the heat actions. In the original, heat actions often did a pitiful amount of damage against bosses and even some enemies. Outside of that, they play largely pretty similar. It's hard for me to really find meaningful changes outside of the damage thing. The only other major thing to note is the recast. Ishin uses the faces and voices of many of its iconic series veterans to portray the main characters. Even so, there are two major characters who don't follow this rule, Kondo Asami and Takechi Hempita, who plays an important role as the game's main antagonist and final boss. For Ishin Kiwami, they decided to replace many of the characters with more modern ones. To some degree, I understand why, as there were quite a few characters from Yakuza 5 they used who haven't been seen in over a decade, so replacing them isn't the end of the world. What's more egregious is the fact that for some reason they decided to replace both Kondo and Takechi, the only two major characters from the original who were original. Hey, slight addendum here, these actually aren't the only two original characters in Ishin who had their appearance changed, as Orio, Ryoma's love interest in the game, also had her appearance changed to be based on Yuki from Yakuza 0. Figured I'd just take the time to address that. Kondo was replaced by Adachi from Like a Dragon, and Takechi was replaced by Shibuzawa from Yakuza 0. I really can't explain why they bothered doing this. Why go out of your way to remove pre-existing characters? It's just such a bizarre thing to do. I can't rationalize it in any way. Maybe they wanted to keep things more consistent, so they decided to make it so that everyone is a series veteran? But the more cynical side of me thinks the likely answer is that they just wanted to appeal to newer fans, using the Yakuza 0 lieutenants as a cheap way to garner interest in the game. Maybe that's a bad way of looking at it, but considering the Majima stuff, I would believe it more than anything else. The only other things worth mentioning are the game's pretty terrible pop-in, which plagues every version of the game unfortunately, and can only be fixed with mods. Another weird thing they decided to do was just reuse Twin Dragons and Pledge of Demon from 0. Like Mine's counterpart got a special remix of Fly, and Saijima's got a special remix of Massive Fire, but the other two lieutenants literally just got audio files ripped straight from 0, which is pretty funny and extremely lazy. It's also worth noting that Ishin Kiwami has a pretty ridiculous amount of microtransactions for mostly useless shit that could have just been included in the base game. And the fact that the game's all around much grindier than the original, although to be honest they're both pretty grindy already, so I didn't end up noticing a huge difference. There's a couple minor visual differences, like the moon is completely absent in this shot in the final boss. They also massively covered up this part where you wrestle naked, which is just an all-around shame. However, even with all of this, there's one massive advantage that Ishin Kiwami has, and that's the simple fact that it's widely available in languages that aren't Japanese. While I can sit here and pretty confidently say the original is better, it's a lot harder to recommend a heavily story and dialogue-based game when you can't understand any of it. It honestly just makes me wish they did a basic remaster for the original instead of going through all of this trouble for yet another subpar remake. And to add insult to injury, RGG boldly decided to delist the original, so Ishin Kiwami is the only version widely available now. Luckily, if you want to play the OG, you can still track down physical copies of the game, so at least there's that. All in all, Ishin Kiwami is weird, and I'm not entirely sure how to feel about it. While it is easily the closest one of their remakes has gotten to fully capturing the original, it's still far from perfect. It played it safe as a remake, which is fine and has a lot of benefits considering the thing I complained about with the previous Kiwami titles. But even when doing this, Ishin Kiwami still has several questionable changes that make it a worse experience overall, which is unfortunate since I can't wholeheartedly recommend the original unless you're a fluent Japanese speaker. I do appreciate what RGG was going for here, but it still misses the mark for me. I think I need to clarify that I don't hate the Kiwami games for adding new stuff that wasn't there originally or making changes to how the games were presented. My issue is that none of it really added anything of substance for me. One major addition to the first Kiwami that I actually really like is the inclusion of new scenes showcasing Nishiki's struggles as a patriarch of his own family, and his eventual downward descent following the loss of his sister. They're all good scenes and help to add to Nishiki's character, which is especially important after his role in Yakuza 0. This is especially important since 0 was a new starting point for many people, so adding in more lore to better help understand Nishiki's downfall is a story that I think is worth telling over anything in the Majima saga. It's a great addition that doesn't conflict with anything that was already established, something which is kinda rare for the Kiwami games. I do think plenty of remakes can flourish with major content additions, but they can also flourish on just sticking with what was already there. That's not to say any of them are inherently bad games, but they do have a lot of missteps as remakes, which lead me to find them subpar. To me, they really are some of the worst games RGG has made. And I'm not saying that because I hate them. In fact, it's really the opposite. They're one of my favorite developers right now. Their ability to create fantastic games in such small time frames, almost yearly, is astounding. But it's because of that the Kiwami games stand out more to me. They feel like some of the lowest effort new releases from their catalog, and when compared to similar games they've made in small time frames, they don't measure up at all. Hopefully the inevitability of a Like a Dragon Kiwami 3 can finally change my opinion. Yakuza 3 itself was only made in 9 months and is fairly barren in comparison to other games in the series, so a remake could do a lot to improve that. But as of now, the Kiwami series and remakes as a whole are not what I'd call RGG's strong points.